banter at the top, but you got to lead it.
Okay.
Here we go. We are live. Hit it up, Sean.
Hey, good morning. Welcome to the Palmer and Holsclaw show. We're going to be talking about deconstruction and depression and dark night of the soul as we wrap up this week. This whole week, we've been talking about the process of spiritual faith deconstruction, what that looks like for different people, how you know you're experiencing it, or if you're not, what are you experiencing otherwise? So Monday, if you were able to join us, we talked about deconstruction as detoxification, detoxifying from a toxic faith. And then Wednesday, we talked about two major reasons why people go through process of deconstruction, which is a failure of facts, maybe something to do with the scientific world or the world that the way they see it, or fellowship, something happening within the Christian community proper. And you're thinking, I just can't kind of go along with who those people are or what they are doing in the world. And so we're going to move to the next phase of that today, talking about dark night of the soul and depression. And we are joined by Jeff's lovely, incredibly voiced wife for audio. Cyd is with us. But before we jump into that, as we always do, as people log on and catch us, we need to talk about something else, something much more pressing. We started this conversation on Wednesday, and so we want to talk a little bit about baseball. And I want to.
Okay, there's more baseball.
There's more baseball talk.
Okay.
So as you and I are, I guess sort of sports mutts in a sense, like we've kind of lived in some different places and adopted different teams along the way and rejected different teams along the way or the periods of time. I am taken because every morning I'm an early riser, and every morning I watch the Korean Baseball League on ESPN. Have you caught this at all, Jeff?
No.
Cyd, is he getting up and watching this?
No. Oh, gosh, no. She would be pretty horrified.
Okay. So here's the thing I want you to reflect on, because I think in the coming weeks, we're going to talk about patriotism and American nationalism and all of those great things. So ESPN desperately needs sports to cover, right? So they have managed to get rights to the Korean Baseball League. And for the entire game, while they're showing the game, have their commentators and guests come on, and they actually aren't talking about the game. They're talking about Major League Baseball the whole time, like the restart and plans for the restart of baseball and the 60-game season.
So they don't even pay any attention to the Korean baseball game.
It's just a veneer of the game, and it's like they talk a lot about the American League, minor leaguers, or folks who've kind of washed out to the Korean League, like, and and so you hear like Mel Rojas Jr., who is doing great in Korean baseball. They're like, could he make it in the majors? And so they're barely covering the game. So what is it, quick question. What is it about us as a people that we can't even talk about the thing that's right in front of us because it's not, the American, like they could have the same show showing volleyball, but talk about MLB. Like it's tangentially connected to the actual sport that's live.
That could be its own show in itself. It's like how we kind of rip things off and repurpose them. And wow, that's pretty funny. So that is why I watched golf a couple of weeks ago when there was the match between Jack Nicklaus and Tiger Woods and a couple other football players, and because I had nothing else to do and I was desperate for sports. So there we go.
Well, so if you're ever bored and early in the morning, ESPN is showing Korean baseball, which it's not a big, it's not Dark Night of the Soul. So
it could be.
But anyway, I wanted to mention that for folks to reflect on as July 4th approaches. And we prepare to have those conversations moving forward. But we do want to get into talking about deconstruction. So I want everyone to know you are watching Palmer and Holsclaw show. You can see it here.
Should I on the sound piece?
Yeah, I always forget that because I don't have it.
I know. Here we go. Boom.
So fancy.
Oh
so
no,
fancy.
isn't it? Like we're almost semi-professionals about this.
Because we're sponsored by Missio Alliance, so they pulled that together for us.
Yeah, you're watching Palmer and Holsclaw show, brought to you in partnership with our friends at Missio Alliance. And this week we have been talking about deconstructing the faith, your faith. So Monday we began talking about the process of deconstruction as detoxifying. And then Wednesday we took the next step and talked about issues of faith and sociology, what's just happening in the Christian community, why it is that people lose their faith. Talk about some high profile people over the last several years who have walked away from the Christian tradition. And today we want to extend that discussion and talk about the dark night of the soul. So Geoff's wife, Cyd, who is a spiritual director and one of my favorite voices ever, just in the little bit of time that we've talked this morning, is joining us. So if you have questions about faith deconstruction and depression, dark night of the soul, as we move through our conversation this morning, please go ahead and drop those in the comments section. We do pay attention to the comments. If you've got a question that you want to ask us, please leave it there. You can follow us here on Facebook, on our YouTube channel. And for those of you who aren't able to get up this early in the morning and be alert, or something occurs to you and you want to go back and listen to this later, we are streamed directly to YouTube, and these conversations exist there probably forever because the internet is written in ink. So I'm going to turn it to Geoff and hear about the dark night of the soul, which is different from the power that seems to keep going out at my house during these storms. So if I fade out, this is a warning. If I fade out, what's happened is we've lost power again. And that's just what happens when you live where I live. So
yeah. Well, but you don't get to disappear, Sean. But yeah, when we kind of talked about this topic of deconstructing our faith, the different kind of pathways that lead to it, I really wanted to get to today's topic because I feel like the language of deconstruction, of criticizing faith or entering into those kind of questions are important and valid. But I think a lot of times people don't have the language of the spiritual journey that we're on, and some of the phases that are not a mystery. And the dark night of the soul is one of those things. And so, Cyd, I want you to start off. Cyd's a spiritual director for several years and a coach, and you have had some conversations where you kind of brought some of this language to bear, and it really helped someone kind of start moving forward. Can you just share that a little bit, and then it'll kind of give us time for us to kind of talk. And then also for all of you who are listening, if you have comments, please shoot them off as we're talking. And we also in the show notes description, there will be 2 books that are mentioned, and we'll drop those in the comments, but they're also going to be in the description. So the books that Cyd's probably going to mention will be in the links.
Yeah. So as a spiritual director, I have the opportunity to walk along with people who are in very different places in their spiritual journeys at different times. And I was with a woman a couple months ago who was experiencing everything was falling apart. And the things that used to work for her, the ways of praying, the ways of meeting God, the ways of experiencing God were all lost to her. And she was in a place where the only other people that she could have conversations with who could understand where she was at were the people that she knew who had decided to walk away from the faith. So she had people in her life who had been, with her in her younger college days. And these were all people who had said, oh, I've been through the same thing. I've had the same questions. And they had all actually decided to leave the faith and to find other alternatives. But as I listened to her, what she was really saying was things like, I just don't have a sense of God's presence like I used to. I feel like the ways that I have talked to God in the past are no longer working. And as I listened, it sounded to me like what she was instead experiencing. I know Geoff mentioned I think it was on Wednesday. I try to listen to you guys after the fact. I can't listen to you live. My brain doesn't go there in the morning. Enough. So we'll see how coherent I am this morning. But
my wife says that whether it's the morning or not, she's like, I can't listen to you.
So I tried to catch up this week so that I could speak intelligently about what you've talked about this week. But I know that Geoff mentioned stages of faith, which I think he was drawing on the book, The Critical Journey, which I'm sure he'll put in the show notes. But there is, so stage 3 is a very active stage where you're actively serving in the church. And this woman definitely fit into that category of actively serving in the church. And then either gradually or in response to a crisis, going into stage 4, which is nothing seems to work anymore. All the things that used to be part of my life, part of my active life with God, part of my actively serving the church, everything that used to be life-giving and everything that used to feel fulfilling now suddenly feels empty or feels like it doesn't fit anymore. And then the wall is something that happens as part of stage 4. And I'll talk about that later. But that stage 4 is very common of things don't seem to work anymore. And so listening to her, that it sounded very familiar to me. And so I just stopped her and I just said, actually what you're experiencing is part of the journey of faith and it's totally normal. And this happens to people all the time. And it's as old as, and I started explaining like all the different people who have written about it. Teresa of Avila, John of the Cross, Bernard of Clairvaux. There's all these different people. You guys spoke about tradition being an important part of faith and talking about the faith tradition and all the different writers over the years that have talked about like this is a normal part of faith. And when she heard that, she was so surprised because she said, I've never heard anybody say that this would be something that I could expect as part of my faith. I've never heard it from the pulpit. I've never heard it in a small group. I've never heard it in a Bible study. I've never heard it from anybody. And she said, it would be so helpful if this was a part of our language in the church that people could know that this is something that is actually part of the process. And so as I started talking to Geoff about that and being like, we got to do better. We have to do better at our churches. We have to let people know that taking everything apart is part of it. And so it brings me back to, so Bernard of Clairvaux actually talked about the transitions of we begin our faith journey because we discovered that our love of self for self's sake is not all there is. And so we start out before we know God or before we have a relationship with God where we're seeking gratification using our own devices and it's all about our own fulfillment. And then we have sort of a moment where we become in touch with the transcendent. And then we decide that we want to love God, but it's still for our own sake. It's still like loving God makes my life easier. It makes my life better. I receive all these good things from God. So it's still very much about ourselves. And then I think the deconstruction comes when Bernard of Clairvaux talks about switching from loving God for our own sake to loving God for God's sake. Loving the giver of the gifts for who he is, not because of what he does for us or what he gives to us. Mm-hmm. And then one step even beyond that is then also understanding as we love God for God's sake, we also begin to see that we ourselves are loved by God and we are lovable and we are God's delight. And so then we're able to love ourselves for God's sake. So we go from this complete obsession with self at the beginning to this reaching for God because it serves us, to then trying to just reach for God, to then receiving ourselves back as a gift from God for God's sake. And so deconstruction is really just a small part of that journey as long as it keeps moving forward. And I think part of the reason we probably get stuck in deconstruction is because as a church, we don't always give people language for this is what the journey is about. And there will come a moment when everything that has worked for you in the past and you will come to the end of your understanding. And coming to the end of your understanding doesn't mean you've come to the end of God. It means you've come to the end of your understanding. And, and we need to push through the end of our own understanding. See, I told you I would just keep talking, Sean. Nobody's interrupted me yet. I got one more thing.
He's taking notes.
I'm taking notes. I'm like totally fascinated. So
yeah,
Sean's talking and I'm taking notes. Like, oh, that was really good.
So one more thing. It was actually kind of cool. I was just reading this morning. Hannah Whitall Smith, who was in the early American days in the late 1800s. She wrote about the unfinished name of God, how God calls himself I am. And then we see Jesus using those words again. Jesus says, I am, before Abraham was, I am. She talks about the unfinished name of God, and she uses the analogy that it's as if a very wealthy friend has written us a blank check.
Oh, wow.
And as I think more about that, it's like, well, when we write in, because we're incapable of imagining just how abundant and generous God is. And so let's just say, for example, we write, okay, God wrote me a blank check. I think I'll try to cash it for $1 million. We'll see if maybe he has $1 million in his account or whatever. So we write in the amount. And then when we come to the end of those funds, we might get angry and upset because the funds have run out. But it's not God that has run out. It's us that didn't have the imagination for just how infinite and amazing he is. And so the process is we have to, like, it's the way forward out of the deconstruction is the humble surrender of, I have no more understanding left. And I want to be willing to be open and to receive that I'm at the end of myself, but God never ends. Mm-hmm. And so I feel like that's what I'd love to. I'll stop now.
No, like what you said was like so great. A couple of things that, firstly, just the normalizing of not only the journey, but the hard, difficult, barren feeling places in the journey. I had a conversation with our family, like, I don't know, 6 or 8 months ago. And I have my youngest daughter is 13. I think she was like actually 12 at the time. And we were talking about some issues around that because we kind of want to have these kind of open faith conversations where you can believe what you need to believe and ask the question. It's just like, we're not going to try to press you into a mold like that. And we're actually talking about someone else that we're close with and difficulties they were having. And my girls have always been pretty much either in Episcopal schools or Catholic schools. Mm-hmm. And my 13-year-old goes, well, that's why most of the year is ordinary time. And she just kind of like said it, like walking through the kitchen and just going off and doing something else, as a early adolescent would do. But I love that for her, that even at this age, something that I didn't know, because I was in youth ministry, right, for a long time. And what we were doing for a lot of youth ministry time was providing kids with kind of like mountaintop experiences consistently enough to get them through the difficulties of early and mid adolescence. And like, I wouldn't have said it that way at the time, but upon reflection, that's closer to what it seems like. But just the normalization is so great. But then also coming to the end of your understanding. But would you call that end of understanding? Like, would you express that as depression or dark night of the soul?
Well, I think so there can be things that are in common with depression because there is a deep sense of loss and a grief, right? There's a disorientation. But I mean, the signs of depression would include things like, so the sadness, the pervasive sadness that can be part of depression, I think can definitely be part of that loss of understanding. It can cause anxiety just like depression can. It can cause pessimism, fatigue, exhaustion. Like some of those things that are there with depression would definitely be there. Some of the difference, I think, would be that, and so Gerald May in his book where he discusses John of the Cross, you want me to pick it up? Is that what you're pointing at?
Sure.
All right,
and I want to be clear for those listening in that what you're describing is not necessarily clinical depression.
Right. I mean, I think we all experience depression at various times, clinical depression. And Gerald May, when he talks about the dark night of the soul, does say, like, there is no good spiritual reason to not treat depression. Okay. Right?
Yeah.
So even if someone is in a dark night of the soul, if they are also showing signs of clinical depression, there's no good reason to not just treat the depression.
Right. I just wanted to be clear for folks who are listening that we're not talking about, like, if you are in treatment, receiving treatment, you've been medicated by a medical professional, like, we're not just saying, oh, that's just a process of deconstructing. I know that's not what you were saying. I just wanted to be, because because of the
sometimes-
Christian tradition and some
Yeah,
people
yeah.
within it who have been dismissive of those sorts of things. I just feel
Right.
like we always have to be really clear
Yes.
about it.
It's
That's
kind
good.
of like in the more charismatic or Pentecostal, it's like every depression is actually demon, and you need to have it like,
Yeah.
cast out of you. But the reason why we do want to bring that up is sometimes, Sean, and I think you had a friend that you kind of mentioned that sometimes like a deconstructive or even what we feel is the dark night of the soul is actually depression. So we're not
Right.
having like an explicit spiritual crisis. We are kind of having a mental health kind of problem.
Yeah, and to give you some background of that, I had a great friend who lived just in a section of the country that's not unlike Jeff and Cyd, where you guys live, where it's just gray and rainy and cold all the time. And she started feeling like, man, I am losing it. I am depressed. Something's wrong with me. And then she took an extended trip to several different cities on a speaking tour and was in Southern California, and she felt so much better, and things were like none of the situations in her life had changed. She goes, oh, like I just needed to see the sun.
Yeah.
Right. Like, and so she moved, and she would say, hey, I haven't felt that way really since then. So there are all of these interconnected, like webbed ways that, I mean, the human body, we like to think of things as isolated, right? But that's just not the way that humans function. So let me ask you, Cyd, like if I come to you as a directee and I feel like I just can't do this any longer, and God just seems absent, what are some practical directions that you would hand me? Like what could I do at that point?
Well, first, let me say that I would have to take a lot of time and ask a lot of questions. So
Sure.
for me to answer you in this 1 second,
Such a director.
It's a 30-minute show.
I know. I think, first of all, like John of the Cross talks about, there's 3 major signs of a dark night that might distinguish it from depression, right? And so the first 2 are common to depression, which is the sense of I can't do it anymore. Like all the ways I've tried to connect with God, nothing is working. I can't do it. Like I seem incapable of accessing God. The second part of it would be that I don't really want to do it anymore. I don't have any motivation for it. Like I don't want to sit down and read my Bible for 30 minutes and journal like I have for all these years. I just don't want it. But then the third sign makes it different, which is, but I do really, really want God. I acknowledge that none of the old ways are working. I acknowledge I don't want to do them anymore, but I do really, really want God. And that might be a little bit different than a clinical depression, which would be, I just don't really want anything anymore. And so I would want to really get to that question of like, is there still a deep longing for connection with God, even though you're acknowledging that nothing is working and that you don't want to do any of the old stuff anymore?
Right.
And then if that longing is still there, then, I would want to give you language for what you're going through is normal. It's a part of it. And so if I could go back to the wall,
Well, just to clarify really quick. So like, just concretely, because we talked about this, like, so because you lose all that energy for spiritual things, but in like clinical depression, you'd lose energy for everything. So if you're in the dark night of the soul, you could still be really energized to parent your kids. You could still be really involved in your home, in your like school association, or still be motivated in your work life. But when it comes to spiritual things, it's just all that evaporates, poof. And so that would be a distinction between like general depression.
Yeah, and I
like
think that will depend on how much of your life you've allowed to be part of your spiritual life, right? Like if your parenting was already part of your spiritual life before a dark night, then you may lose motivation for your parenting because you consider it part of your spiritual life. But yeah,
so back to the wall.
Yeah, so I think, one of a picture that helps, a lot of times people will talk about going through the wall. I like to think about going over the wall because it helps in the sense of like, if you're weighted down with a lot of things, if you imagine yourself standing in front of a wall that you have to climb, you can't stay where you are. You don't want to go back to where you came from. So the only choice in front of you is I have to get past this wall. You'd want to shed everything heavy so that you can get over that wall. So if you have heavy things in your pockets or if you're carrying a backpack, you'd want to get rid of all of that so that you can get over the wall. And so really what happens in stage 4 when you've come to the end of everything is it's a process of laying down the attachments, laying down the things that you have worshiped in place of God that you didn't realize you were worshiping in place of God, whether it was a system or whether it was a doctrine or whether it was a person that was really influential in your life. You need to lay those things down and shed those attachments in order to become more fully attached to God himself. And so that's when the longing is, I lost my passion for the old ways. Nothing works anymore. But I do still want God. That's a transferring of attachment for, I don't want the stuff. I don't want the practices. I don't want the system. I want God himself. And if that little nugget and that little longing is there, then there's lots of surrender, lots of humility, lots of going through Ignatian discernment about attachments and false spirits. There's lots of stuff that can move you from that place. And there's lots of tradition things that we can borrow from people in the past. But I think the first step is the willingness to start shedding it all. And I think that's where people get stuck in the deconstruction is I've come to the end of it and nothing is working, but now I want to blame somebody. Or I want to blame a false understanding, or I want to blame a doctrine. I don't want to do the hard work of looking at what I need to let go of. Right. Instead, I want to accuse. Yeah. And as long as I can accuse, then
that could be attributed, but that's not. Yeah.
Well, and I don't want to fault anybody for that either, because as a church, we haven't done a good job of giving people language and understanding so that they can locate themselves in the middle of that space. And so I don't think there are that many people who are in a stage of deconstruction and who are stuck there, who would honestly say, I'm choosing to be stuck here.
Right.
But the church hasn't given them enough resources, which is why we're doing this theme for this week and just trying to show that for a lot of people that feel like deconstructing or dark night of the faith is the end. It's, they feel like it's the ending of their faith.
When actually it's a new beginning beginning, much richer, much deeper.
And I think a lot of, especially conservative faith traditions, they promised like this ticket to heaven, and they didn't lay out the whole journey. Or, we just went on our 20-year anniversary, and it's kind of like the brochure or the email that says we got the tickets is not the real thing, right? And I think sometimes we've kind of confused kind of the ticket, and the destination and the journey and things like that. And so we're trying to kind of give language to broaden that. Someone jumped in. I think it's Teresa. I'm going to put this up here because I love doing the comments. She asks, discerning gifts, how does a prophetic or a lament fit in with the dark night of the soul? Do you see them as separate? And how does this fit in with a changing relationship or vision of God? I'm going to throw that to either Cyd or Sean. Like, how does lament and the dark night of the soul, how might they fit together? I think of Jeremiah, and the destruction of Israel and kind of what he went through.
Yeah, I mean, I'd love to jump in on that one. I think a part of what I did when I was talking with this woman who, was feeling angry and like nothing was working anymore. Part of it is that one of the big turns we need to make is instead of talking about how we're disappointed with God or how we're upset that God isn't who we think he is, the biggest turn we can make is turning toward God and actually speaking that to God and saying, I'm angry with you. I'm disappointed. I'm frustrated. Things are not working. And so what can feel blasphemous or it's like you guys were saying, the Psalms are in the Bible. And God can handle our disappointment and our frustration and our anger. And so I think turning that directly to God is a beginning of staying in relationship. We talked about how faith really is relationship. And so the moment that we get stuck in deconstructing is a disconnection from relationship, but turning towards God and lamenting and saying, the world is broken. These people are not who I thought they were. This faith is not what I thought it was. This church is letting me down. These people, just say it, give it all to God. And I think that is part of the process of moving out. There's a healing there. That's what I would say.
And because Sean said,
I want to know if Sean wants to say something about that question.
Jumping in.
No, I mean, I don't know that there's very much that I can add to that. I was kind of taken with something you said a little bit earlier right before you said you started, folks can tend to look for someone to blame, partly because we haven't given them handles or guardrails or very much guidance for this very natural evolutionary part of their faith. But what it sounded like to me was like there are a lot of folks who reach a point of just disillusionment. Like when it's kind of like you sign up to go to there are these shows in Houston. This is what makes me think of, well, I guess they used to happen in Houston before everything got locked down. And you would pay money for a night of concerts, right? But you never knew who you were going to get or what style. And it was really big with late millennials and early Gen Zers. And I was, because they never had chairs. You like kind of go and you sit on the ground, like on them. And I was like, I'm too old to go do that. But some of my friends actually played those shows. And so you could get this folk duo followed by this like marimba band, followed by like these hard rock guys. And you would get like 2.5 hours worth of music, but you never knew what you were getting until you got in it. And I see that sometimes in faith, except folks think I bought a ticket to a rock show, but you get into it and it's like, oh no, like there's a string quartet and you're like, man, I didn't sign up for a string quartet.
Yeah.
And then there's like a jazz singer and it's like, I don't like jazz. And the problem was on the front end, the person who sold you the ticket didn't properly prepare you for what you were getting into. Oftentimes,
for sure.
And saying like, oh, this is going to be a great journey. And too many churches of all scales, in my experience, have projected, and we do this when worship styles and preaching styles because they don't ever change. Like, man, like sometimes in the question they mentioned lament, like churches actually just need to have lament services, like, and we need to be much more careful about our language when folks we're here, welcome. We're going to have an hour of celebrating what God's done. Like, well, not everybody here is interested in celebrating what God's done today. Some of us are interested in lament, and you can't. And some of us have some deeper questions about certain things, or we're really like it's really been hard. We're great when a national tragedy happens to pause and reflect, but only for like 7 minutes in a service. And then it's like, let's get back to what we normally do, which is up tempo, high beat. Like that's one of the things I love about our community at Ecclesia is like, when people ask me to describe the worship, I said, the thing that I like most about it is it's not jumpy, right? And you know what I mean by jumpy? Like it's just like fog machines and you're jumping up and like, no, it's like, this is how people live. And we have historical liturgies of the church and lots from the Psalms. And I think that sets a more realistic template for what life with God is actually like. Does that make sense?
And I think if we had in our services more times of laments, more regular times of confession, the dark night of the soul wouldn't feel like a total aberration. It's like, oh, I see these parts in the Bible that do this. And, I've done little small versions of this corporately. And so now that I'm in the midst of a really big version, I'm not as freaked out.
Well, and it is difficult because with people being at different stages of faith within your community, like not everybody's in the same stages of faith at the same time, and they're circular and they're not necessarily, totally linear, and you go back and forth and you circle around. And so there's always people at different places of faith. And, as leaders in communities, we can't always be exactly where people need to be.
Right.
And so there is a place for having jumpy music sometimes and lament sometimes, right? But being able to do all of it at different times. And then just having the language to normalize that we're all in different spaces and that's okay. And just because the person sitting next to you will feel threatened by the questions you're asking right now, that doesn't mean that those questions are not okay to ask. It just means you need a different companion. Like you can't ask that person who feels really anxious and nervous about what you're asking to come along with you. But there are people in this community who can come along with you. So don't stop asking the questions, just find a new conversation partner. And so that's where I think people get lost is if they don't have people who can sit in the questions with them, then they feel like something's wrong with them. And that's not the case. The case is the person that you're talking to is in a different spot and they don't need to join you where you are. You just need to find someone else to talk to.
Yeah, it's been really helpful when Cyd's like, because we keep talking about and we have a kind of a mandate, but of like trying to figure out a discipleship process with the spiritual, with the stages of faith, and making sure we have, programming is not the best word, but it's just something for people to kind of help them move through those stages. So if any of you are out there listening, throw in the comments like, yes, Sean, Geoff, and Cyd, like, please have the full stages of faith, because we kind of just keep alluding to it. But that's kind of what we're hoping to do a little bit.
Well, that makes me think of a couple of things. So one is my friend, I don't know if you've read any of his work, but Richard Beck, who is probably just one of the smartest people that I know, years ago wrote about this idea, connecting some of that, some of the deconstructive process with what he calls summer and winter Christians. And like, there are some people who are just summer Christians, and to like, it just has to be, their personality is geared toward jumpiness, right? And like, we even got an email one time from a person who came to visit, and it was just one of those weekends where the music was a little bit more muted and slower, and she talked about how much she loved it, but like, she telling our worship leader, our worship pastor, like, like, more up-tempo stuff, like, this is the first time she's ever been there. And so like, what I'm describing in terms of lament and celebrate, like, is a menu, like, over a course of a year.
Right.
Like, if you stick around here, I say this in sermons, like, if you stick around here long enough, we'll talk about everything. And then you have some people who just like can't do that because they're winter Christians, and so much, and the way that they move through the world isn't necessarily depressive. And I'm one of these people. It's just more melancholy, and that's the way that they interact with the world. And if it's all jumpy, like, they look and go, like, faith isn't for me at all. And so both of those. So I think there probably is, and you can kind of reflect on this some too, like a personality gear too, where like, if things are too good, I think something's got to be wrong with that. Right? But like, if it's too, and I'm an optimistic person, generally speaking, but like, it feels very like there's very much a veneer over things. If it's like too, like, that makes me suspicious. So I just want a church that normalizes that full range of human emotion, interaction, and exchange with God. And if it's not for you this week, that's the power, beauty, and the difficulty of community. Like, well, come back next week and we'll see what it's like then.
Well, and that goes back to that transition of, we don't just love God for our own sake. We don't worship together for our own sake, right? Like, coming around, like, part of the journey is we worship together for God's sake, and we receive ourselves for God's sake. But like, that awareness of growing together, it's like, anyway, I won't go off on a tangent there, but that idea of like, it's not
communal.
It's community, and the highest goal of our worship is not what I get out of it, or if it fits my personality.
Well, thank you to Mike and Rebecca and others who have thrown some of the comments on about needing more lament, and how faith and grief and joy and grief can fit together in community. So thank you for that.
Absolutely.
I was thinking, as you mentioned, summer and winter Christians, maybe you're more the winter Christian. Cyd definitely knows I'm like the summer, like, I'm like more joyful, very positive. But I was thinking, well, what about people like Cyd? She's more of the changing of seasons. She's like, this can't last this way forever, and now we're going to boldly go into the next season, even if we're not ready for it. Isn't that kind of, you're like the changing of season person?
Yeah, I think I am.
Cyd's neither like all summer nor all winter. She's like, let's
I'm
go.
in a constant state of putting away one set of clothes and bringing out a new set of clothes.
That is true.
Yeah.
So true.
for people who live in a place where the weather hardly ever changes, right? That's my understanding of.
Yeah, so you guys need to move kind of into the Midwest so you can have 4 real seasons instead of hot season and cold season down there in Texas.
We have hot season and a touch less hot season. Like that's pretty much
so
what it
growing
is.
up in California, we had the temperature didn't change a lot. It was just dry season and wet season. So that was like our
the great thing about growing up in North Georgia, which is Atlanta is considered North Georgia, is that it's deciduous forest. I learned this in 5th grade. Is that you do get 4 distinct seasons. And I wonder if there's like a lesson for the church in that, like not only the liturgical calendar, which I think is really helpful, especially when it comes to issues of dark night of the soul and deconstruction. So like Christians have spent time dealing with this forever, and we've routinized it because it's so much a part of who we are and what we're doing. Like it's that normal. But before we go, I wanted to give you a chance because of the title of your most recent book. And this comes from a conversation that I had with a group of guys that we have been friends since college and a prayer group in college. We were all really close. About 2 years ago, we were having a conversation. All of us are in ministry of some sort of stripe, whether it's academic theology or counseling or local church ministry. And we arrived at this conclusion together that I'd love to get your feedback on, that most of the problems we deal with in Christian context, from 18-year-olds in my friend's freshman Bible class, all up to the folks we deal with in church, which is up until late life death. The question that keeps coming back up, the question that's under the question is, does God really love me? And it is pervasive in ministry if you're asking the right questions. So there's not a question in that. I just wanted to give the two of you a chance to talk about that, because it is the most pervasive question that I encounter in 22 years of ministry. That's what's under everything else.
Yeah. And I think it fits in with our conversation today too, because I think part of the deconstruction process for people can be a sudden realization that the formulaic thing that I've been doing, or the thing that I'm supposed to, sorry, I was distracted there for a second.
My phone just went off. Go on.
Okay. Sorry. That's you, Sean. Do you hear yourself talking
I hear myself
on Jeff's
coming
phone?
back. Yeah.
Okay. So okay. I'm sorry.
Does God love me? Does God really love me?
Yes. The book. You're giving us a chance to talk about our book, and then I'm losing the moment. I think underneath the deconstruct, because you guys we talked about it. You talked about it earlier this week too, about it's a relationship. When we come to the end of our understanding, often that understanding is, I see myself more accurately, and I can't believe that God could still want to be moving toward me as I am. And I see God's people, and I can't imagine that I want to be part of a people that behave like that or act like that. And it ends up feeling like God has this, like, you're in, you're out. I love you when you're like this. I don't love you when you're like that. When you behave like this, you're on my good side. When you don't, then, and I think to get to the place of God can take great delight in his people, even when we're behaving really badly, which I know is hard to stomach. But I was just trying to explain this to Jeff, and he didn't feel like this was a good analogy, but let me just say it and see if maybe it'll fit. So when we can have compassion for ourselves because we know God has compassion for us, I think that opens up a whole new world for us being able to have compassion for the people that we don't understand, right? So the idea of losing faith in the faithful, when we see people behaving badly around us, we go, I don't want anything to do with whatever they're part of. I don't want it. I was just at Costco yesterday, and I was just this is a thing that I struggle with, right? Like I pick something up off the shelf and be like, oh, that's a good price for that. Like I don't really need it, but it's like, oh, that's a good deal. I'm going to put that in my cart. And then maybe 5, 6 aisles later, I come to my senses. I'm like, oh, I don't really need that. Well, what do? After harping on my kids for years and years saying, put things back where you got them from, I'm always tempted to just leave it right on the shelf where I am. It doesn't belong there. That's not where I got it from, but that's where I want to leave it, right? And I have to go through this, like, I have to go put it back where it belongs. Now, the reason I'm saying that is because that kind of impulsivity is the same thing as people who post something on Facebook that I find to be completely repulsive. It's an impulsive moment where they do something very public that is very difficult for me to receive, but it's the same root behavior that I just experienced in Costco. And so when I can have compassion on myself because I know that God has compassion on me, I can also have compassion for the person who posted in a moment of weakness and impulsivity. And I don't have to condemn them immediately for that behavior. Instead, I can say, I want to move toward that person with compassion and curiosity because I know that God has compassion and curiosity for me. And I feel like that's where, like, if we can understand that God is a God who really does like us and really wants to be with us, then that can help us to continue to move toward others. So anyway, I know you gave me a moment to talk about the book. So the book is Does God Really Like Me? Discovering the God Who Wants to Be With Us. That's the book. And part of learning to have compassion for ourselves can change an awful lot. So that's...
Thank you for that. And I just want to say, because at some point we're gonna have to come back and have a whole like Enneagram conversation. Because my wife is the person who walks it all the way back to where she got it from, stopping to put things that other people have left in the wrong places back where it should go.
Is she a 1 or a 2? Or?
That's so responsible. You know what?
Cyd's an 8.
I do both, right? But like sometimes I'm like, I don't have time for that nonsense. I'm just going to leave it here, which I know is completely disrespectful and rude. And I apologize to all the people who work retail who have to put things back. I try not to do that.
I don't, because I feel like when I do that, I help secure someone else's job safety. Like they have to employ somebody to put all these things back, and I'm making sure that person keeps their job. So Cyd, thank you so much for joining us. I've really enjoyed this conversation. I wasn't going to ask any questions, but I was so fascinated by what you were saying. So my apologies to Geoff if I overstepped. But
oh no,
I'm the one that talked the whole time and made you run up for what, 50 minutes now. So that's my fault.
Yeah. And Rebecca is checking in, and she loves your wife, Sean, because I guess she's also a 1. So we love you, Rebecca. Thanks for being a part of the show with us. And next week we are going to be kind of leading up to Independence Day, 4th of July. We'll be asking questions, something like Sean and I will be discussing this over the weekend. But how do we think about statements like God bless America? How do we think about freedom and the freedom that the gospel gives to us and the freedom that we often celebrate politically and nationally? How do all these things fit together? How can we think about them with the lens of the Bible and the cross all together? So that's coming next week.
So thank you for joining us on the Palmer and Holsclaw show. You can join us here every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday at 8 Eastern, 7 Central, or on YouTube. So you can follow our channel, like, and subscribe to us. As the YouTubers say, smash that subscribe button and you will get you will get updates when we're live and when new shows are posted. So thanks for joining us. Have a great weekend. Bye-bye.